It's, I think, a good time to start. I'm Aurelian Kuyutsu. For those of you who might not know me, I'm director of the program, and it's a pleasure to welcome all of you. Thanks for taking time. Join us for this Ostrom lecture in political science conference, given by my friend, Professor Stefan Kolev, who is now a visiting fellow at the James Madison program at Princeton University, and he will be effective, or he will be taking the leadership of the Ludwig Erhard Forum for Economy and Society in Berlin, which is an exciting new initiative that Stefan was elected to lead in the years ahead. Stefan also teaches economics at Technical University in Zwickau, and he has been writing a lot about ordoliberalism, on the works of German ordoliberals. And today's topic is Hayek's journey to resilience, which is, I think, the preparatory work that Stefan is doing with Bruce Caldwell and the other collaborator, whose name I forgot, which will be work on the second volume of Hayek's biography to be published by University of Chicago Press sometimes in the future. The first volume was published here. So Stefan will talk for about 40 minutes. I told him that that would be the desirable time. And then we'll take questions and answers, including from those who are joining us online. I will accommodate their questions as well. So please join me in welcoming Stefan back.
Well, thank you so much for the digitally. It does feel like coming home. I mean, I was only here for 3 months in the fall of 2019 as a visiting fellow of the workshop. Those amazing pre-pandemic days. So now coming post-pandemic and hopefully, it really feels wonderful. So thank you. Thanks for having me. And yeah, what I would like to present today is certainly something which relates to what Aurelian said, but it's a slightly different project. So this is joint work with Markus Brunnermeier, who is a macroeconomist at Princeton. So I will start, we'll have this set up here so that the recording records all the slides and the room. So Markus wrote that book, The Resilient Society, last year, which, as he says, was his Corona essay, or the essay on the pandemic. He's a highly technical macroeconomist who has been struggling with macro finance and how financial crises in the past, but also especially theoretically. Aurelian mentioned, quite a bit of report. Some of my research, also when I was here at the workshop, had some focus on Hayek and the ordoliberals and how, especially Vincent, related to the ordoliberals. But the title of the paper really is a theorist, I think, and somebody who is interested in economic thought, but more specifically in the history of theories. Can we perhaps have a productive cooperation? So think about Hayek as a scholar, as a person, but also draw from that some perhaps more general questions about that important, as Markus and I see it, sort of new notion of resilience. So, first of all, I would like to show you how Hayek's life, specifically the traumatic decades of 1930s and 40s, help us to understand how a person like him handled his own failures, both as a theorist and as in the conversation of young scholars, the ones in the room. But then how biographically he rebounded, which is basically a different definition of resilience. So the system has been hit or has moved to a better equilibrium, but then somehow it finds the mechanism to rebound it, to come back to some better state. So there is some biographical insights which allow us to get some idea about how he handled the Great Depression, but also how he handled his own depressed state of mind during that time. And out of that, I hope that you can get in the second part to some more framework of resilience, which is inspired by both him as a person and him as a theorist. Now, in 1932, in late 1932, he still writes a letter with colleagues from London School of Economics, to the London Times and says, our business cycle theory is correct. So we should stick to the hope that the purification mechanism of the depression is good, and there is no need to expand the economy. It will work out. Very few months later, March 1st, 1933, he gives his inaugural address at the London School of Economics because he has recently joined the faculty there. And the lecture is very different. Actually, you can see, if you compare those two documents, but also his early trust in his theory and the new skepticism, which you clearly sense in 1933, you'd see that something has tipped. So you see a person who is in a different set of his mind. Somebody who is struggling and who understands that the laissez-faire, meaning non-interventionism, independent of the context, somehow is not the right thing to do, not in this context, but also not historically, as he argues in the lecture, as he argues in a letter his mentor, Ludwig von Mises. Basically, it says we have failed as theorists to save Central Europe, and we have to do something new. So in that letter, he says there is a need for a new liberalism, but it will be different from the laissez-faire liberalism of the past, because it seems to be that the wonderful dynamics of the spontaneous order, as he would later call it, can be extremely explosive. It can really, really harm society. There is some shift. Now, the problem with moving here. So the problem is, of course, in the meantime, this had happened, right? So Hitler had not just become chancellor, but also the Reichstag burned down, so primary republic passed. Hayek was an Austrian, but he cared a lot about Germany for obvious reasons. So something had happened, and the paper in the first part asks what actually did happen. So first of all, we entered a new conversation, and all of that means ideas don't just come in isolation. You sit there, you get a new idea, you get into a new conversation. So those are the liberals whom already mentioned, and they were somewhat faster to understand that already in 1931, you should not look at the depression as a purely economic phenomenon, but instead, something which has to be seen from the lens of political economy, meaning that the economy had to be seen as an interdependent part of society, because otherwise, we just studied without understanding that its interfaces to the rest of society can be disruptive. And this is Henry Simons, an important, even though still young economist at the University of Chicago, who thought along the same. In 1936, when Keynes published his theory, so to review it, and so we have those two failures. A diagnostic failure, so his theory somehow didn't handle, could not explain, could not diagnose the depression properly. It could explain why you got a boom in the 20s, but not how deep and sticky the depression had become. And in 1926, he lost the battle of Keynes, in the sense also that young scholars who were around him at the LSE basically moved to the Keynes camp. When I gave the talk last week at the University of Pennsylvania, there was a very smart question which was posed, which was, if we understand that Hayek was here playing chess with himself and obviously looks somehow gloomy, if we try to answer the following question, we might get a bit of an insight. The question is this: how did Hayek recover from all of that? But Max Weber, who was also important for Vincent, did not. So Max Weber got into deep trouble around 1900 and never mentally recovered. So the whole of his rest of his life left behind brilliant fragments, but he could never write a long book. He could never work as he wanted to and as he had done before. So how did Hayek handle that double failure? And how did he come back as a person, as a scholar? What was his biographical resilience as I think? First of all, left technical economics and became a political economist. So as we'll show in a minute, that implies not just that you switch from equilibrium to order as the leading notion of your economics, but it really shifts the focus on only studying the economy as opposed to studying the economy in its interdependencies. But there is also a second shift, which is that rhetorically, if you take that 1933 inaugural lecture, he's very skeptical to tell the students in the room that he's a liberal. For some reasons which are related to Max Weber and Weber and an understanding of Weber and his value neutrality, which comes now to distance himself from. So he wants to become a political economist, openly normative. What emphasizes that political economy has some normative presuppositions, and I have to tell the citizen about that. It's not pure science, which is detached from values, and I have to be open in about my normativity. So those are the two twists. I call them the theoretical and the rhetorical. Why does that matter? Well, it matters because the whole view of the economy and the whole view of society, which is the second box. So he understands that laissez-faire must remain a part of the liberal political economy, but he shifts towards something which can be called laissez-faire within rules. So for that dynamics, the economic process to be something beautiful, you need a framework of rules which at least curtail its potential to become not dynamic, but dynamite. Right? So you need, and that's what we call embedded spontaneity. So spontaneity is fine, but we need good rules. In all kinds of domains of political economy, like monetary policy, et cetera, et cetera. This is equally important, or perhaps even more important, which is that the economy is connected to all of those orders of society for those interdependencies. And those arrows, which you can understand as interfaces, are very powerful tunnels. And so the economy, if you only study it, you miss that it can send out nice signals, as in post-war Germany, or terrible signals, as in interwar Germany, and has the potential to destroy the whole system. So in shaky times, as the 1930s, or today, as I would claim, you should not study the economy in that isolated way, but you should understand that it has those important interdependencies in those shaky times that can make the times even more shaky. Fine. Now, why is that important for the paper? So in the paper, we play around with two sets of metaphors. One of them will remain in the definitive version, and it's an early paper, so I'm really grateful to hear your comments afterwards. The one set of metaphors, and that's the one which we currently prefer, but it's very new for us. The whole idea of the paper is also new, is that we want to link the notion of the depression, both on the micro level, meaning a person, meso level, meaning a neighborhood or a community, more generally speaking, and the macro level, meaning the economy and society on that abstract level as we saw it. We want to link the depression to the notion of resilience by saying that the link on all of those three levels is the constitution. On the micro level, when it comes to an individual, it is the constitution of our physical and mental health, which is decisive for coping with the depression. On the meso level, of course, it will be the rules of either a company or a neighborhood which run the game. And on the macro level, it's the constitutions as we usually use the term. So it is the constitution and our capability to reconsider it. We cannot change it quickly, but to reconsider it, to remember how our constitution handled previous episodes of depression so that we cope with the current one, understanding that it's different from the old shocks. So we should stick to the principles which we understood our constitution is based on, and yet be contextual and understand that every situation is different. And that applies both to the depression. We define a depression here as a moment where you lose the trust, then the rebound will be automatic. All of us have fluctuations. For many of them, we just don't care. We say, well, okay, I'll have a beer and then I will just rebound and I'll be back to normal. The depression is a moment where we lose the trust. And resilience in that set of metaphors would be something like this. At that very same time when Hayek writes The Road to Serfdom, He writes a paper called Individualism, True and False. And true individualism is an individualism where the individual understands how important it is that it's part of the community. So resilience could be the way you cope with your depression to come back, might be that you understand that it's not you alone who can handle the depression, but that you are embedded in communities in plural, right? So you have your neighborhood, you have your friends, all of whom can help you. And you also, of course, are a citizen, so also the macro level can help you. So you basically understand that your constitution is embedded both in the institution of, in the constitution of the communities and in the macro constitution in which you live. So it's the moment where you understand that you are not a superhuman who can handle the depression himself, but it's somebody who needs help. So you need your own memory, how you handled your past depressions, but also you expand understanding of your constitution from it's just me alone who handles my life to a moment where I can only handle such super difficult situations by understanding my own embeddedness. And that helps me to rebound. But only then can I rebound. I cannot rebound myself being self-dependent or somehow an autarkic superhuman who handles the depression. So that might be one set of metaphors, which I'll have a brief discussion in the end, which are much more Austrian than the one which is coming up next, which is more of an engineering metaphor. And it has some advantages because both the citizen and the scholar have gone through such episodes. It's a set of metaphors which doesn't put the scholar on a superior level, be the citizen. Everybody has suffered through moments where you question your constitution, where you understand that you need help. Of course, there are experts who study certain weaknesses of our constitution, and yet a conversation of equals between those experts, like a psychiatrist, a neurologist, physiotherapist, and all of that, and the citizen is actually possible symmetrically. So they can talk without the one being the expert and the one giving a monologue to the other. And it's, of course, also a metaphor which is not just about explaining the phenomenon, but also includes this hermeneutic perspective that you need to understand the other person in the German sense of verstehen, and only then can you actually help that other person once you have put yourself into the other person's shoes. And it's a biological metaphor, so it comes with quite a few advantages, but it's of course less tangible and less clear-cut than what you will see in a minute. But it is what we get from this biographical episode. So Hayek rebounds. He becomes a prominent liberal political economist, and he gets his new friends. So the picture here is the founding meeting of the Von Pellerin Society. So while he lost the youngsters in the 1930s to the camp of Keynes, he's successful in getting new friends who can help him later on when he gets in new difficult episodes of his life to rebound. I saw in your office Hayek just next to Karl Popper. So when in the 70s Hayek gets his next depressions, it's Popper who is actually giving him quite a bit of help and advice and also mental counseling. Okay. And Popper is sitting somewhere here on that level of the room, which is not visible.
There are all the reactionaries there, so it
doesn't matter. Neoliberals, as you would call them. And as they, okay. Very briefly, what they agree about is laissez-faire only runs in the rules. You need competition which destroys power and creates innovation. You need to constitutionalize the economic order, but as you can now see from this new metaphor, which goes back to the individual and the individual's own institution, it's really about those various levels of constitutions which are decisive for the system running and not crashing. It's sensitive that all of those systems, the individuals, the groups, and society are fragile. And all of them are openly normative in the sense that they say, if you want to listen to us, we'd rather share the common normative perspective that a certain understanding of liberty and a certain understanding of justice is the presupposition for all of those political economic propositions to be valid for you as a citizen. Okay. Now comes the next set of metaphors, which is, as I said, something which is easier to understand, but more, let's put it like that, less Austrian, if you care about Austrian economics, or if you care about the symmetries or asymmetries between the expert and the citizen. So you can understand all of that also in the metaphor of the stadium. So in the stadium, you have the citizenry, which is either playing the game or observing the game. But let's think of it as playing the game. So we have the super dynamic game of the economy, which changes by the second. You have the normal, formal, legal rules, which can be either, I mean, we have them in the room, so I don't want to be very specific about that, but it's either normal law or constitutional law. And of course, they have different grades of dynamics in the way they change or the interpretation, we change them. And then the whole stadium has foundations. And those foundations are, of course, since this is a Tocqueville lecture, mostly we can best perhaps capture them with the notion of culture. So what Hayek understands early on, and this is also what I would like to focus on, is that the stability of the foundations, the resilience of the stadium resides crucially on one thing, which is that each and every one of us learns not when we're depressed, only when we're depressed, but also in the normal times of our lives, both of the individual and of the neighborhood and of society, that we live in those two things at the same time, in the small communities in plural, but also in the very abstract extended order of society. And we should not let the abstract order of society, which has a different logic from the logic of the small community, be dominated by the logic of the community. So we have to learn to live in both, right? So the logic of the community is that I have a friend like Aurelian, and I can show huge amount of solidarity. I can discriminate against everybody else and invest all my solidarity into him. So there is no need to treat people equally. There is no need to give people the equal opportunity or equal access. No. He's my very best friend, and I can really, really focus. I can show solidarity, I can sacrifice, and we do that all the time. And society, which we entered somewhere when we entered modernity, is quite different, right? So there the rule should apply to all. Solidarity is different because it's billions of people, and the person who produced that coffee got something from me, but it's not my solidarity. And since we've lived for a very long time in communities, but not so long in society, Hayek is worried that at any point, like 1933, so that's his diagnosis of National Socialism, the community can overrun from, they fully use the word, society. And National Socialism was, of course, that you have both the community on a national basis, and on the class basis, which the Nazis played with both cards, which trumped the bourgeois society of the Weimar Republic, or briefly speaking, of Germany pre-1933. So the foundations of the stadium will only be resilient, will only take the earthquake, which is on the next page, if, and only if, we learn to live in those two worlds and to bear the tension of living in them. And our living today in a global and digital world, that tension will get better, meaning more easier to live with, or can tear us even more apart. I would leave that for the Q&A, but it is important that it can help. So I'm from Bulgaria. My machine can help me to give me back my community so that it's easier to live in Germany or in the US while I'm away from my old communities. But of course, it's equally possible that the machine makes me more tribal than I was in the pre-digital age. And so I have even more difficulties to live in that abstract order of society. Now, the stadium is, as you can see, in a tectonically difficult area. So there are all kinds of shocks. Of course, depressions, come back to the set of metaphors before, don't just happen only because of shocks. We can also have endogenous mechanisms within the system which create problems. It doesn't have to be something coming from the outside, but it's easier always to think of shocks as being exogenous. And so the question is, how do we handle all of that? We, meaning the players and those experts, economists, lawyers, sociologists, and as you'll see in a minute, also historians, how do we handle those lessons of resilience which we have hopefully learned from the past? It's very important for Hayek, it's very important for the Austrians, but actually it's also very important for me always to emphasize that we see the world in so many different ways. So the facts, and this is of course a human insight, it's not Hayekian in the sense that we know that for quite a while, we have very subjective opinions about the facts. The point with that smartphone, so all of those people in the stadium have smartphones and experience the stadium from smartphone, which is equally true about, by the way, about the depression metaphor. We experience reality through the smartphones, which have made the world even more subjective in the sense that we don't just basically frame our own media reality, but because of social media, we are actually even now capable, each and every one of us, to feed in our subjective opinions into the public discourse. So the degree of subjectivity, because of that feedback mechanism, has become even larger. How do we cope with that mess? Well, we need some learning. Okay, that's a sort of not a mind-blowing point, but if you think about the 20th century, and if you think about us today, I'm not sure whether we have learned the lessons of the 20th century, if there is such an objective lesson, or to what extent we have learned what has happened before. So what we do here in that second set of metaphors, but it's also applicable to the first set of metaphors about the depression, is that we need something like a memory. We need something, not just in the phone, which is our memory chip, so we remember with which rules have we handled which crisis, how well, but also as a society, we need something like a database. This is, of course, difficult, because if you take the objective point seriously, it means that you need somehow a mechanism to feed in the subjective information which comes from the phone into the database. Now those channels here must be the role which I believe, or which we believe, has to be taken by historians, but also by social scientists, of course, generally speaking, because historians cannot do the whole job themselves. They also need the specialists to cooperate with it. And so those different parts of the database will be coded various historians who, of course, have their own subjectivity, their own ideology, their own way of interpreting reality. And yet we have something like a memory. And then when the next crisis hits in, we can hopefully be able to tap that past experience. It will be a multitude of voices from the various social scientists who have decoders to that memory, ideally also the citizen. But of course, here we have this asymmetry, which I already mentioned. So perhaps more the scientists, the experts, and the citizens who can read the database. But ideally, citizens should be also enabled to. And we should very ideally not only be able to learn from our own mistakes, from our own successes, but also to learn across space, so that we can also have the lessons of other people. The pandemic, which I was lucky not to experience when I was a fellow here, might perhaps be one first exercise. And in a certain sense, it's also potentially at least a productive exercise, because we had various geographical locations all over the world experimenting with very different rules, both formal rules and foundations of very different cultural rules. We made very different experiences. Now, in the second model of the stadium, we might be able to learn from our own mistakes, if we're willing to accept that we made some, and from the mistakes of others, so that when the next pandemic or something similar hits in, we basically can tap the database and at least avoid the greatest mistakes. In terms of time, I would use the last minutes, which I have according to Aurelian, to summarize and to compare those two sets of metaphors. So let me summarize by this. We had a conversation in the morning with some students, which was about our times today. Of course, history does not repeat itself. It may rhyme itself, but we live in times which at least sometimes remind me of the 1930s and 40s, without, of course, equalizing the tragedies back then with our problems today. We live in those times which are extremely fragile and which sometimes might give us the feeling that the system is about to break. Unlike socialism, where he and I grew up, it seems to be that our Western capitalist, bourgeois, whatever you would like to call it, system seems to be more resilient. There is a recent book by Princeton historian Harold James, which came out in German, coming out with the Yale University Press quite soon. In German, it's called Shock Moments. So he studies the last 150 years and how we experience moments which needed resilience. And he shows that, first of all, the system did show resilience, but it was always perceived by the citizens as being about to break. So there seems to be some flexibility. There seems to be some possibility of the system to adapt, but we should not take it for granted. So question of resilience, meaning mechanisms inbuilt in the system that can bring us back, that can bring the system back to normal or to something which is at least not terrible, are a crucial thing to study when you have such a system which is fragile. Resilience is something different from robustness. Robustness asks the question, will the system handle the shock? Will it really break or not break? Resilience assumes that the system will certainly adapt, but it should have the capabilities, and ideally over the course of time that should get better, to handle the crisis even better than it did in previous times. Why we, meaning my co-author and I, prefer the biological metaphor of the depression is that all of those crises and all of those periods of depression are painful. But nevertheless, if we put ourselves into our own shoes, and if we think about how we handle different difficult moments in our lives, we seem to have some capability to learn. And we also, and this is an important Ostromian point, if I may say so, we also have the capability to talk. Right? We have our individual suffering going through various phases, but if we can talk about all of them, if we can find categories how as a group and ideally also as a society, we can handle about those problems which have individual aspects, but can also be categorized. We can talk about how each and every one of us handled the depression, how each and every one of us understood in the moments of difficulty, physical and or mental, that you need the community and you need society. And perhaps it's exactly those moments of depression which teach us how normal times, in the non-depressed times, we have to learn to live in that combination of community and society, which has been so difficult to live in the past, especially 100 years, so that we do not repeat the big mistake of the 20th century, as Hayek, but also I would see it, which is to let the community trump the logic of society. All of that is painful, but somehow, to end optimistically, it turns out that we handled gigantic crises over the past 150 years, not just the Great Depression, but also other problems which we had since the 1840s in a resilient way. And the interesting part is that after each crisis, we came up with a new technology, which was dormant. Then, because we needed it, because we needed to expand our own constitution and to tap that technology, we all of a sudden started using that technology, and it helped us. So, for example, in the 1970s, that would be the container ship. The container had long been discovered, but because of the difficulties of the 1970s, because companies had to adapt their supply chains, they started using the container, which has become so foundational to today. So perhaps the pandemic has given us not just the vaccine, but also the technology underlying the vaccine. And so perhaps we can handle issues like cancer in better ways than we could. But there is one condition, and this is my final sentence. The final condition is that we can handle episodes of superfragility. And superfragility are moments where a too large population of our society just unsubscribes from the stadium or from that embedded constitutions, which were the first set of metaphors. So when people say, I'm out of the game, I want a different game, I want fundamentally a different stadium, then we can lose the battle. And that's what happened in 1933. So the whole generation, which you saw, those evil neoliberals, actually invested their entire intellectual energy for the rest of their lives to prevent or to set up a post-war order which would not allow the system to collapse as it did in 1933. So the lesson of learning resilience on the individual level, on the communal level, and on the societal level basically has this one goal. How do we get to a system which embeds spontaneity, drives us in good ways, and when the next big crisis hits in, which will certainly come at some point because crises somehow belong to that order of society in which we live, how can we handle it in less painful ways, especially, of course, for the weakest parts of our society, which actually experience, again, coming back to the pandemic, those huge crises in the most painful way, as opposed to us academics or people who make good money or something like that. With that, I would like to conclude and very much hope to hear from you with some feedbacks, including, of course, the digital audience. Thank you so much.
How to check if there are questions online?
I will
start with the room, but
let me
carry the audio.
So we see Michael.
Yeah, Michael is there. Okay, good. So we'll take questions and comments from us, and then we'll combine it with the others. So let's start with Mike. We have plenty of time for a conversation.
Stefan, as always, your work is very thought-provoking and trying to get my mind kind of around what you're getting at. And let me give you my initial effort to try to push your metaphors a little bit further, because it's important. I like both the metaphors. I think both of them work in different sort of ways. But let me start with the first one, because I think in the question of individuals, how they deal with depression or other sorts of issues, your sense of resilience is good. Your sense of people being embedded in different communities or different social networks is very good. But I think another way of looking at that is that any individual in the span of their lives participates in a lot of different roles in those different social networks or types of relationships they're having. They have different kinds of roles. And I think one of the characteristics of mental health, I don't know if I've seen a good definition of that or not, or being healthy, is an ability to adapt to what you're doing and what you're seeing and what you're thinking to the situation that you're in. So that you treat family members differently than you would treat strangers. You treat servants differently than you would someone above you, or something like that, that we can perceive the kind of social situation that we're in, and we can react to that appropriately. And so that, resilience is not quite the right term there, I'm thinking more something like balance might be sort of appropriate, that an individual might be mentally unhealthy by being so unbalanced that they see everybody as an enemy. They become totally paranoid about it, or they become totally afraid of spiders or something like that. That one part of their lives sort of expands too far and dominates it too much. And I think that kind of an imbalance would create the kind of super fragility you were talking about, in the sense that they screw that up, then they're done, kind of like, And so resilience is also kind of a sense of maintaining the right kind of balance. So I'm comfortable with that sort of at the individual. And what that means at the level of economic order, the role that economic order plays in society as a whole, with social orders, legal orders, political orders, technical, social, and all these sorts of things. I'm seeing now where Vincent got his notion of what polycentricity sort of is that it kind of have to have polycentricity in all these sort of orders, if Hayek was sort of talking along. It seems to me that one way of looking at that perspective on the economy is that the economy is not just an entity unto itself that can be understood and studied as a separate process isolated from the other parts of society, but that just like each of our roles are connected to different sort of roles, economics order is connected to political order, to legal order, to technical order, to epistemic orders in different ways. And so that in a sense, just like the individual plays different roles in their social lives, the economic order plays different roles in social order. And that if you just look at the economic order as an economic order, you miss the fact that it's also playing these other roles. And to continue the metaphor, the analogy or whatever, if you only look at the economy as totally isolated, then you naturally lose the sense of order. If you only look at the economy as being critical to support a national security, you get a connection to a totally protectivist sort of political economy when you try to become self-reliant and autark in the economy. That's a very fragile kind of system compared to one who's sort of connected to different approaches. So does that sound like the kind of way you might take this kind of an analogy of this metaphor to understand that resilience is a way of maintaining or regaining or discovering a new balance, that is something that is survivable in a way that a total focus on just one aspect of that would not be.
You spoke like a perfect moderate, Mike, there. So you deserve to be praised for that.
I've been hanging around you. What do you expect? But no, I mean, it's very much, I've really gotten this sense of balance from reading until.
This is immensely helpful, and I really mean it. And let me say why. So when I was saying that resilience where you believe that you are in big trouble, which we can call a depression, when I said that would be that you become resilient once you understand that you are not alone. You cannot handle it like you can handle your normal life. Sometimes we believe alone, but that in those moments specifically, you are embedded in the social context in which you live. We can basically draw the same picture which we have here, the interdependence picture, and say, well, this is the individual. And those interfaces become important existentially important in the depression, right? So that is the moment where you need to tap all those resources around you that can be human beings, they can be specialized help, et cetera, et cetera. So I love that. And I also love the balance point, because it is, of course, true that, mental health, various diagnosis differs, but it's certainly true that you can wrongly overemphasize or even absolutize one thing at the cost of everything else, which, by the way, I think as societies we keep doing all the time. We have become very monothematic at a time. So we have just one absolute thing, and everything else has to go away. No trade-offs.
Like the left versus right or red versus blue state in this situation, you know, families not wanting their family members to marry people from the other party. Absolutely ludicrous.
Exactly. Or if you think about the topics which we debate one topic at a time. In the COVID time, we debated COVID.
Right.
Everything else had to step down. So I really love the embeddedness. And then if you see that we have all those channels, all those different roles, which you say to different people, that the trick is not just to understand that you have those channels, but to cultivate all of them as opposed to focus on just one and to hope for help from just that one aspect. And then actually your life becomes even more difficult. A lot of people say, well, so this is immensely helpful. Thank you.
So I have a general question following up on Mike, and then a sort of just historically specific question. It strikes me that resilience isn't the only really crucial value. I think adaptability is equally important. And I'm thinking, first of all, you have Schumpeter's creative destruction. You've got Doug North's conception of adaptive efficiency in a non-ergodic world. So the next shock is not going to be like previous shocks. It's not, at least not exactly the same. It's going to be different enough to require different maneuvers to deal with it. And so if I, bearing that in mind, and I appreciate why Hayek was not a Keynesian in the 30s or really throughout the rest of his life, but whether he would be at least something like a neo-Keynesian now, with an understanding. I mean, again, it's about empathy, about being able to put yourself in someone else's shoes. It's just almost the very definition of liberalism, liberality as an individual virtue, right? And so, yeah, I just wonder if he'd see the need for a broader set of adaptive mechanisms than he saw at the time. And then my very specific question, also related to Keynes, is what did Hayek think, if anything, of the economic consequences of the peace?
Okay. Let's start with that one because it's easy. He loved it. As his entire generation did. Keynes was a hero of those boys, both in Austria and in Germany, because they had just come back from the front. Mm-hmm. And somebody told them that what was being done in Paris is wrong morally, wrong economically, and extremely dangerous for the future. So, and when he meets Keynes for the first time in the late 20s, he's still a great fan. That actually never changes radically, right? So that respect, that applies in a certain sense to the whole generation. That respect lasts well into the 1930s, perhaps even forever. So that is absolutely clear, okay? And I think there are many hypotheses why he did not review the general theory, but I think there is an interesting way how you can see that he was not so far away from Keynes, which I will say something about, but that the two terrible figures in his life were Freud and Marx. Mm-hmm. So Freud and Marx, in the notion of resilience, which we're discussing here, would be people who, on the individual and on the societal level, would not just doubt, but probably diagnose that you cannot get resilient, so that you are breakable and that is your fate, sort of, right? So
under capitalism,
and in the bourgeois society when it comes to Freud. Okay. Now with Keynes, it's really different in the sense that Hayek understands in 1933, as I try to say, that something has to be done, and this is not a normal depression. What the entire generation objected to is that you take the Keynesian recipe, which was done and written for that very particular depression, or that real depression, and you start applying it as a toolbox for normal recessions, fluctuations, which we just can call them normal recessions. But in a certain sense, both of them and the ordo liberals got on the same train, which is we want to save capitalism. We want to make it viable on different trajectories and with different means. So that's really the big difference. So is the system reformable? Can it learn? Can it become adaptive? Or is it doomed? Whatever we social scientists or we citizens would do. And I agree with you that the tricky part always is principles on the one hand. So you have remembered some principles, some rules from the past which have served you well in the previous depressions. And then the contextuality or the specificity of the next shock. The tectonic plates would move in a different way. And so you have to be principled and contextual at the same time, which is the trickiest part of political economy.
Schumpeter thought we were good.
Well, the very late Schumpeter certainly, and
well, he believed many things.
And by the way, I also would link that to his mental health, because I believe that if you think of Schumpeter after the death of his wife and mother, he actually never recovered. Right, so he wrote a big book on business cycles, and certainly the 1942 book. But something very fundamentally tipped also in him. And if you are in that shape, you perhaps see the world, not monocausally speaking, but it helps to see the world in a very gloomy way.
Absolutely. I'd like to pick up, just for the sake of the conversation, two things here. One is that the way in which you present Hayek is an interesting one. It goes against the grain, which is to see Hayek as a neoliberal, a fanatic of laissez-faire, unregulated markets, free trade. And this is the image that is portrayed by the critics of those reactionaries at the Mont Pelerin Society in 1947, which as Bruce Caldwell published recently the transcript of that, we know that they were actually concerned about real issues, not about unregulated markets. But the first question, Stefan, is whether you make of Hayek too much of an Eucken type of thinker, because all of this constitution, level of constitutional orders, I think is deeply ingrained in the Freiburg school. And you are an Eucken fan, I'm too. And I think that I'd like to see what you see. I mean, is it a little bit too Euckenite, Hayek you present, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but maybe not. The second thing is, what do you think the implications of your talk would have for those today who announced the death of the Liberal Project, who think that the Liberal Project is doomed because there are no internal resources for revigorating its agenda, that we need a new horizon beyond liberalism. And this is the message that my friend Patrick Danin and others are announcing to the world. And what can they learn from, for example, reading Hayek in your lens?
The latter one is a really tricky one. So first take the first question and simultaneously think about the second. Okay. So certainly, I have openly a tendency to equate Hayek and the ordo liberals too much.
It's the nail in the hammer.
I do have some other hammers as well, but the point is this. In the very specific context, which is also at the heart of this paper, which is the 30s and 40s, I really believe and can show, and there is a long paper which is now coming in the Journal of History of Economic Thought, that in that moment of urgency, they were very contextual when it comes to the time. They were driven by the time. And they knew that, in terms of Hayek, imperfect as your knowledge is about rules, or the levels of rules, you have to say something. You have to have a liberal positive agenda, which, as I said on that slide, is rule-based and et cetera, et cetera. And the constitutional point is not smuggled in from the ordoliberals. It's very explicit. I mean, if you think of, so socialist calculation debate, so socialism is terrible. And the whole project which comes afterwards, there is a booklet in 1938-39, first comes out in 38, called Freedom and the Economic System, which then transforms it in the road to serfdom. Already has some positive program, which then evolves into the Constitution of Liberty.
A better book.
Well, different
book, yes, thanks then. And then transforms into law, legislation, liberty, which is really about the foundations of the stadium. So I don't think I smuggle it in too much. I think that in contrast to the Keynesian attempts to save capitalism, that's basically the answer of Hayek, the ordoliberals, Old Chicago, but also some other fellow travelers who would meet at Montpellier Society, but also some others, which is instead of trusting the powerful experts like Keynes would, rather entrust the system to the rules, which hopefully will be adaptable, so we can learn about even better rules. But for the post-war world, we have to come up with some, because otherwise people will not subscribe to liberalism, which in a certain sense is also the reply to your second question. So I know few liberals who would, for example, deny that the abstract level of the extended order can harm the community. So the communitarian critique that communities may have suffered, and perhaps also causally have suffered, because we live in those two worlds, is valid. So in a conversation which you would like to have, I would start with outlining some shared criticisms of the world in which we live. But first of all, I would love to hear from the critics of liberalism a positive program. It's a sin which also many liberals committed in the past. They will always say what is bad about alternative systems without proposing one. Second, I would really look at what that generation had to offer. But third, and most importantly, perhaps, and that's why I like the term neoliberalism, is that certainly we today who believe that liberalism has a future have to come up with a new neoliberalism for our times, which has to be technologically updated for obvious reasons, which has to answer questions which that generation didn't think of, et cetera, et cetera. So I would be critical to the world in which we live. We cannot be apologetic. It has its problems. And yet I would emphasize that, as I see it, I would try to reason why that is the case. It's the best world which has ever existed. And then our task, and that of course is directed both to scholars who are critical and to citizens, is to show how we can make it even better. And for that enterprise, for the latter enterprise, I find the depression metaphor more appropriate because it puts us on the same level. We can have a conversation of equals in which both the citizen who has worries about the world and us social scientists can actually sit together and talk. So I'm not pessimistic that that conversation is possible. Of course, it presupposes goodwill, and that has become a scarce resource on both sides of the political spectrum around liberalism. But perhaps for that, resilience is really a good opener of the conversation. So we see the fragility. I think we all do. Some believe that it's good, so it's good that it will break. We suggest that, complicated as it is and painful as it is, the system has some inbuilt resilience which can be improved if the citizen and the scholar takes a seat and just talks about the problems, the really existing problems, not some utopian visions.
Couldn't you argue from that in fact liberalism is less fragile than people suppose?
It turns out,
because historically it survived lots of challenges already.
It turns out as I discussed that briefly, that book by Harold James, that it has been very resilient. And yet, of course, as you said early on,
it's easy to attack.
No, I think it is fragile.
Yes.
I think it is fragile. And yet, so if you combine the notions of fragility and resilience, I think that's what it is, right? So it's fragile. It always looks as though it's breaking. And there are moments like 1917 in Russia or 1933 in Germany where something close to a liberal order can certainly break. But there are so many other examples how it didn't break. So it's fragile. When it gets super fragile, it's easy to burst. But if we avoid the trap of super fragility and learn together as students of human affairs, together with the citizens, how in the past, and that's why the database and the historian, how in the past we learned those various lessons of resilience, it can teach us something.
One addition to your point, Dan and Stefan, I think there is a danger that is brought forth by the rhythm of change. So to give an example, we live in a world, an economic world that is a 21st century world with the new technologies, digital world, and so forth. You can transfer money in and out of the states at a decent speed, and you don't have to worry about that. But the political structures are those of the 20th century, if not 19th century. So there's a kind of disconnect between the economic order, which evolves at a high speed, dizzying speed, I would add, and then the political order, nation states, you name it, that are reminiscent of the 19th century. So I think that's the challenge, how to adjust the two.
That is why this picture is so decisive.
Yeah, it is.
We always have dynamism, and we only live with that dynamism if there is a minimum of security provided so that we can handle the dynamism.
It doesn't throw it in.
So that once you get unemployed, and the likelihood today, so many new jobs has become, even which 10 years ago we didn't think it would be. So once you get unemployed, once you see the risk of constantly getting unemployed, there should be some constant voucher which the community and or society gives you so that you can systematically trust that you can re-enter the dynamism by learning what you didn't know before. So the learning process, which, as I said, is central to resilience, should really be institutionalized so that people trust that the dynamism doesn't kill their human and social capital.
As of now, they are likely to join a wacko party.
Oh, sure, yeah, because they are just terrified and they don't see an offer of stability, which ensures that they bear with the dynamism.
Europe's economy is often described as sclerotic, and perhaps it's because they have tolerated such high levels of unemployment for so long, at least in part. And then it's those high levels of unemployment that you say and to radicalize.
Well, I think the US and Europe have sort of, in a certain sense, if you take the dynamic, let's call it dynamics and statics, if you take the two, we have the symmetrically opposite problem. I mean, your country is too dynamic and we're too static, right? And I think I wrote
That's why Americans like to go to Europe.
I know, and we like coming here for the opposite reason. That's exactly, I think, again, talking about learning across time and space, that's, I think, exactly how we should mutually, the West, consisting, broadly speaking, of those two halves, should try to learn from the other part. So I think this country realized with the past president that many people seem to be lost. We in Europe fundamentally understand that we cannot keep up with the dynamics of neither the US or, at least as of now, China. So it's very obvious to me, at least, that if there is a transatlantic moment of learning, of mutual, be exactly that. How do we in Europe get more dynamic? And how do you provide the stability which people need to cope with the digital and global dynamics which surrounds us? So I think there is also the job of the Erhard Forum should be so to bring people from both sides of the Atlantic exactly to talk about that. It's easy to be arrogant. It's easy to believe that you're superior, and to a certain extent we all do. I think the mutual understanding that we can get into our respective superfragility for those reasons, right? So the US because of superdynamics and Europe because of superstatics can actually open a space for learning, and then the liberal project can become indeed more, let's call it sustainable, right? So because as it seems today, we do have these two big problems, which I think also taken together actually make add up to the big problem of basically of political economy, which has always been liberty and order, right? So liberty can bust the order, but also the order can stifle liberty. So the very spirit also of this place, of this house, is how do we combine them? I think in a nice way, we could do the transatlantic learning in that regard.
Yeah, so I'm curious just with one way in which Hayek's critique of liberalism gone awry might actually align with a lot of the critics of liberalism. Mm-hmm. In Constitution of Liberty, when treating Mill and responsibility, he says that Mill probably went too far in overstating moral coercion as being actual coercion. But then a decade and a half later, he says that the decline in liberalism begins with John Stuart Mill's On Liberty. And that this overly permissive society, he doesn't say community, he talks about the over permissive society as being a real threat to liberalism. And that's what a lot of the critics of liberalism right now are also saying. But as a solution, and I'm thinking here about individualism, true and false, and others parts where it relies on Aristotle, there seems to be an amenable solution where you have these small communities of citizens coming together and figuring out what justice is and solving problems together. I like to think about the jury because we're in the Tocqueville room.
You want to think about it, but not being part of it.
Sometimes, yeah.
Just like most other Americans.
But yeah, I'm curious about that tension where, and I know it could be dismissed as just a bitterness to the direction liberalism was taking, a bitterness towards Freud. But it seems Hayek's a lot more comfortable with using morality, using small communities to come up with justice than maybe some other liberals are.
So let me first say that his relation to Mill would be a different talk, which is a very long talk. And
it's not a good relation.
So there is a wonderful volume, The Collected Works, which is called Hayek on Mill, so in volume 2 of the biography, a very early episode would be that trip which he and his second wife do on the steps of what Mill and Harriet Taylor did 100 years before. So so again, I would never, neither the early nor the late remarks take them on face value. He's struggling with Mill, but in more substantive ways. So I think the big question of morality and why it comes fairly late in his work may have two sources. The one source is that in the late 1950s and early 1960s, there is this big fallout in the Montpellier society, but also his tensions with conservatives, both like Röpke and US conservatives. So he understands even more that the tension between society and community, of which I spoke, is not just one socialists don't see in his way, also other, let's say, people on the conservative spectrum. So that's the one thing, and that worries him fundamentally. Second thing is, of course, 1968, right? So somehow he sees that he's always a fan of evolution in all kinds of ways, but then he sees something like revolution, right? Where people want a genuinely new moral code, like the students of 1968 and all of that. So Those two issues make him, first of all, more sensitive to the foundations of the stadium, but second, perhaps also more conservative. As to the small scale thing which you mentioned, I wish he was more Ostromian in that regard. I wish he had a better concept of civil society and of small communities. I mean, as I said, in individualism, true and false, and in many other places, you would understand that we live in those small communities, and it's wonderful because, as opposed to the pre-modern world, we choose our communities. We're not just born into them and forced to live in them. But again, I wish he understood that the spontaneous order, well embedded, is not. I wish he had said more explicitly that this is something which can be observed in the economy just as in other societal contexts, like civil society, like the Ostroms would, of course, make the very strong point. So I wish he was more explicit about that. You can find the traces. I don't say that you can't, but I wish they were not just traces.
So you say that Hayek didn't read Vincent Ostrom?
I mean, age-wise, I think.
No,
I think we stopped reading at some point. I think Vincent
stopped very early on.
I think
the great minds stop early on. So they only write. They have to make a decision, right? Reading or writing.
Enough time to do both.
No, you can't do both. But there's a joke about Hayek. Not that we have time for jokes here, but when communism fell in 1989, he was fairly old. He died 3 years later. But he couldn't believe that communism would fall. Since you are writing the second volume of biography, was he totally not, I would say dogmatic, but was he unable to understand that communism could fall?
No. This is something with which we struggle about. My personal position currently, and there is quite a bit of evidence for that, is he was too ill at that time to understand. He wanted in the late 70s, early 80s to have this debate about socialism. He believed observing really existing socialism. And of course, we spoke earlier about China a bit, but I have to do more research about China. But observing the sclerosis of really existing socialism, he saw that he was winning. I think he and the Austrians were nevertheless puzzled about the longevity of that project. The problem with the perestroika is that it's exactly 1985 that he starts becoming very old. So you cannot have a position about whether Gorbachev is a savior or...
So he was not.
No, he was not well. But I'm really interested in that hypothetical question, what he would have said, both about the reforms of socialism, probably not very positive, but certainly also the years right after. So that ordoliberal Hayek, which I devise here in a moment of urgency where things just have to be done because things are falling apart. My hypothesis is that if this is rightly diagnosed, Hayek 4, which will be the Hayek of post-socialism, would probably need to do something like that. Which of course is even more difficult than saving capitalism and liberalism in the 30s, because in 1990, there was nothing to save us, to save in our countries, right? So you really have to start from scratch, and you really have to do something which he never actually advised, which is set up a genuinely new system.
So if he were to replace Leszek Balcerowicz in Poland, what would he have done? I love these questions because there are no answers.
But there are other questions that are capable of being answered. Did he read Kornai?
He stopped reading a long time ago.
When did he stop reading? Kornai was writing as early as the 70s, right? I mean, he had not made the anti-socialist turn, perhaps, until the late 70s.
Kornai was major.
Yeah, I mean, all of those questions, first of all, let me put them down. I'm grateful for that. Intuitively, I would rather say no, but I have to check.
I also want to just add to it that he might have been more surprised at the relatively peaceful ending of communism than the end of communism itself.
Sure. Yeah, I like those hypothetical conversations.
Because they are basically meaningless.
No. I don't find it meaningless.
What if history had been different?
He had predicted that communism cannot be sustained because of the socialist calculation problem.
But
your Boltzerovich question. Let me try to answer that. So if we take the resilience point seriously and the learning point seriously, and that's what Boltzerovich would actually say, right? So he just started collecting all kinds of, he says, stamps, so experiences with King. How did West Germany do the job after the war? How did Korea do the job? So basically, history does give us a lot of partial patchwork type of answers, but certainly not the answer how to set it up from scratch. Also, of course, I mean, thinking back about the database, you just also didn't quite know what exactly it had erased, socialism, right? And in different countries, it had erased differently, let's say religion, for example, which is a source of resilience and all that, right? So I think also coming again to the contextual and specificity point, you would have needed very specific proposals for Poland as opposed to Romania, as opposed to the Soviet Union, and all of that, right?
So, the contextual thing is everything, right? Because Poland never suffered collectivization of agriculture. Stalin gave up on that project.
Yep. Unlike Bulgaria, where in 1946 it was all done.
Yeah, and but West Germany had the Marshall Plan. All Boltzerovich had was Jeff Sachs. Basically.
Yeah, and you certainly,
because the first thing he did, right, was convert the hidden hyperinflation into obvious hyperinflation to show everybody that radical reforms were necessary. Because he got blamed for all of that, but.
Other comments, questions, curiosities? What would Hayek have loved?
Michael.
Yes. What would Hayek?
Michael.
Muted, Michael.
No, he is not muted.
Okay, one moment here.
Yeah, we need to unmute.
One moment. All right.
No.
To unmute, yeah.
He is unmuted, but we are asked. No.
He's unmuted, but we're not hearing him.
We're trying to get Michael. Harry, how do we do this?
So can you hear me?
I hear someone running.
Yeah, is this something I can do here or not?
Really, go to Michael's picture at the bottom right.
Yeah.
Bottom right, just underneath it, and click there for add to unmute.
There is some. We need some.
It's not doing it.
There's a hardware
doing it. We're trying, Michael.
Wait, I have another.
I wouldn't worry about it. Just let him ask the question because it looks good on the Zoom.
Okay,
You can't hear it here.
You can't hear you.
Can't hear him.
No.
Okay, Michael, can you hear us?
Yeah, I can hear you, but can you hear me?
It's really strange. I can hear him upstairs.
Really?
David, can you come off mute? Do you know?
Yeah, go to
I don't know how to unmute Michael.
Go to the little microphone in the corner, down in the left-hand corner, and check your audio set, or just select the speaker. Make sure that it.
That's really strange.
Maybe the speaker isn't set right.
Michael, can you just write it in the chat?
Write it in the chat. Yeah.
Well, same.
It's weird because this displays differently upstairs.
Change whatever speaker you have set up.
All our efforts at unmuting have failed.
You know what I'm saying?
Hearing something magical.
Did you try?
Yeah.
And if it's the audio's on,
It's
bottom.
Seems to be.
This is
Open that up and see if the audio's.
See, same as system. Somebody talk.
How many doctors are in this room?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Medicine?
Yeah.
I can hear someone.
That's me.
Okay.
It's not just.
That was the problem. The audio, the speakers weren't set to the right speakers.
Did he say the speaker works what?
Wasn't set for the right speaker.
Okay, we're trying to There we go.
Can you hear me now?
Yep, I'm messing with the speakers.
Michael, can you talk and make sure that we can hear you?
Yeah, I put something in the chat.
Say something else.
Okay, so can you hear me now?
Yes, yeah.
Thank you so much.
That Russian accent is
Yeah, I know, it's hard to understand. So I put at least part of my question in the chat because I just heard us talking about how socialism failed and all that stuff, but at least if you look at the political component of it, it seems to be coming back. It seems to be quite resilient. And the other question I had was about this metaphor about foundation and so of the stadium and all that stuff. Because what is interesting is that both in Russia and in China, the systems, the overall systems, so both political and economic, became seemingly more resilient when they switched the economic system to more or less, all right, somewhat market, but the political one sort of seamlessly has shifted to the old kind of non-democratic, illiberal system. And something like that seems to be going on in Hungary and maybe to some extent in Poland even.
Okay, so first of all, I agree with you that socialism as a mentality is surprisingly resilient. I don't mean it, I mean, I have a very strong opinion about that, as you know, but if we forget about that, I think that an idea that we have lived so long in the community and that we find bourgeois society and its economic system so counterintuitive, and that we are in constant trouble of distinguishing how we treat our friends and how we treat our fellow citizens, I do believe that this is a burdensome thing. Right? So it is something which, thinking of my parents in post-socialism, but as you say, also people in Western societies, it's just, I believe, a constant burden which liberal social scientists of all fields have to keep talking all the time about. So I think that is why socialism, which basically unifies those two logics, there is no distinction between the small group and how you run a society, is so powerful because you then do away with the tension. And your question about basically the stickiness of the political system or the coming back to some authoritarian political system, both in China, Russia, and in Eastern Europe. Yeah, so certainly it makes, I believe, the interdependence picture, which we had before, more powerful in the sense that it is not, so basically what you need is, so to get a liberal society, you need all those sub-boxes to adapt. Some of them, however, seem to be very sticky, and there seem to be players in those boxes with high stakes, both ideologically and in terms of interest, to not let them change. And then it's not the economic system as in 1933, which bust the political system, but vice versa, right? So you can have a thriving economy as in Hungary, but then the political system is the one which actually doesn't allow the whole system to transform in the way it would. So in a certain sense, I always think of it as, so some of those complementary boxes, one would be already enough, and actually be the pulled handbrake, which does not allow the whole other box, which might be doing well, normatively speaking, in terms of liberalism, to move. So there is a knockout condition built in the interdependence, which is that one box already can knock out the whole transition. And I think you're perfectly right. And I mean, Aurelian said it also before that, of course, the political system is just less quick in adapting. And especially if you have a legacy in that political system, which is invested in bringing it back to what it used to be, it might go sometime, but then it's very easy to get it back to what both an aging population, which remembers the good old days. So that would be the demand for the old system, but also suppliers of the old system, like Orban, might form a very powerful coalition, of course, framed with a nice ideological anti-Western frame. And then the whole transition, I wouldn't say becomes meaningless. I mean, Hungary is not a place I would live in, but it's certainly a rich country for Eastern European standards. But nevertheless, one of those complements is already capable of blocking the whole journey. So resilience, and this is a super important point, is not about, it's not enough to cope with depressions in the economic order, which you and I, of course, naturally most think about. But depression in one of the other boxes can be equally fatal to the whole process.
So, before Orban's retrenchment, Hungary had liberalized politically. So what was required of him was to do more than just prevent liberalization politically. Right? Much like Xi is doing now with the economy in China, for example. And so the political movement that he's riding has to be stronger than it otherwise would be.
Again, I think we have become smart how we can do that, right? So you need an aging population. You need to feed its memories of the good old days. You need propaganda which tells you how terrible the West has become. So that already creates very powerful demand for something, for a retrenchment, as you said.
COVID helps.
COVID helps as well. So
European Union helps.
European Union, well, strange.
Yeah, narratives about the European Union can easily help. So all of that,
the money from Brussels.
So all of that creates a demand and supply for an alternative political system, which in the course of 10 years can work out quite nicely. And of course, the other box, which in the Polish cases, which you know much more, is of course the legal system. So how quickly you can capture also that one, so that you then have two of the boxes which are not running. And if you're able to capture, like in the Russian case, the church, which probably was always captured, if you think of the past 80 years, that would also give you a religious order, which feeds the legitimacy of that retrenchment, right? So
as well as also, where is the way to voting? Is it rural? Is it urban?
Yep.
Also affects.
We can pursue these conversations over sandwiches because our time is up. I'd like to take a moment to thank Stefan for those who joined us online and here. There'll be a second event which will be building upon this talk on February 10th. Mike McGuinness, Dan Cole, and myself will be trying to present some work in progress from a book manuscript that we've been working on for too long. It's called Who is Afraid of Liberalism? So some of these topics will reappear in conversation on February 10th.
Also mention other things on Monday.
Nick, do you have any announcements about your talks in February?
Not this Monday, but next Monday.
Oh, sorry.
We have Josh Blackman from Cato talking about the future of the Republican Party and federal society. And where
it's a short talk.
Yeah, but Professor Cole will be responding. And then that Thursday, Patrick Deneen will be coming here to discuss common good constitutionalism in 2023.
It's February 9th,
yep.
A day before February 10th. Thank you again.
Deneen with an I, everybody.
See you soon, and more sandwiches and
so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.